I've given this testimony 3 times now, to 3 different boards, and each board has asked me the same question in a slightly different uniform. I will answer it the same way I answered before, because the answer has not changed and will not change, no matter how many times the ascendancy decides to be surprised by it. You want to know how we lost Sestin 7? I was provost magistrate of the occupation. I held the seal of the Office of Civil Reduction for the full 19 cycles of our administration there, from the landing to the withdrawal, and I signed every reduction order that left my desk. If there is a name the board wants to attach to the failure, mine is the correct one. I am not here to spread it across my subordinates. They did exactly what doctrine told them to do, and doctrine was wrong, and I was the one wearing the seal when we found that out. Let me begin where the records begin, because I want the board to understand that nothing about the early administration was unusual. There was no warning sign we missed. There was no clever human trick we failed to anticipate. We did everything correctly. That is the part I need you to sit with before I go on, because every board so far has wanted to believe we were sloppy. We were not sloppy. We were thorough, and the thoroughness is what destroyed us. Sestin 7 was a settlement world. The humans had been there perhaps 4 generations, long enough to build proper towns, short enough that the soil maps were still in their archives. There were 11 population centers of any size, strung along a temperate band, and a scattering of smaller holdings in the high country. Total population a little over 9 million. By the standards of the office, that is a small file. We had reduced worlds of 40 million with 2/3 the personnel I was given for Sestin 7. I remember thinking, when I read the establishment order, that I had been over-resourced. I remember being mildly insulted by it, as though Central did not trust me to manage something so modest. I want that on the record. I went in confident. I went in confident because the doctrine was sound, and the doctrine had never failed me. The board has the doctrine in front of it, but I will state it plainly for the transcript because the words matter. Civil reduction does not mean extermination. It never has. The office exists precisely so that the ascendancy does not have to kill 9 million people to govern them. A population is not a wall you knock down. A population is a structure, and every structure has load-bearing elements. You do not demolish the building. You identify the columns that hold it up, the leaders, the organizers, the ones the others look to, and you remove those carefully, surgically, and the structure settles into a shape that can be governed. The crowd that loses its leaders does not become a more dangerous crowd. It becomes a frightened, leaderless mass that wants only to be told what to do. We had reduced 240 worlds this way. The method had a name in the field offices. We called it taking the head. So that is what I set out to do on Sestin 7. Identify the head, take it. My first cycle was all mapping, and the mapping went beautifully. Humans are not difficult to read in the early going. They are social to a degree that the Marethi find almost indecent. They organize themselves into committees and councils and associations for everything. They keep minutes. They put up signs with names on them. Within 40 days, my analysts had built a lattice. That is our term, the lattice, the map of who holds a population together, and it was the cleanest lattice I had ever seen. 11 town councils, a planetary coordinating assembly that met in the largest settlement, a militia command with a clear rank structure, labor organizers in the mines and the agricultural belts, religious figures, the handful of engineers who kept the water and the power running, who in any settlement world are worth more than any general. We had names, faces, residences, daily patterns. We had the columns of the building drawn out on a board the size of a wall. I stood in front of that board with my doctrine officer. Her name was Sub-Provost Lyra Sund, and I will speak of her again because she is dead and the manner of her thinking deserves to outlive her, and I told her it was the easiest reduction I had ever been handed. She agreed. She had served under me for 6 administrations. She did not agree to flatter me. She agreed because it was true. We took the head. The first reduction order I signed on Sestin 7 removed 11 people in a single night. the chair of the Planetary Assembly, the 9 most active town council heads, the senior militia commander, a woman the humans called by a single name, Okonkwo, who according to our profile had organized the original Settlement Defense Corps decades earlier and was the spine of their entire security apparatus. 11 columns, pulled in one coordinated action before dawn quietly with as little blood as the method allows. By doctrine, the morning after a clean decapitation strike is the most dangerous window. The population wakes, finds its leaders gone, and either panics into riot or collapses into compliance. The riot is brief and the compliance is permanent. We were staged for both. There was no riot, there was no panic. I noted this in my log as a favorable sign. I want the board to see how favorable I thought it was. The transcript of my own assessment, Cycle 1, Day 44, population response to lattice reduction, muted, no mass disorder, compliance trending positive, recommend acceleration. Acceleration. I recommended that we go faster. I want you to remember that word when I tell you the rest. This is the appropriate moment to introduce the detainee, because I met him during this same early period, and at the time I thought him utterly unimportant. I have come to understand that he was the most important human I ever spoke to, and that he understood everything I am telling this board today before I had understood any of it, and that he tried, in his quiet way, to tell me. I did not listen. That is also on the record now. His name was Aldous Crane. He was, by our estimate, a little over 70 of his planet's years, which for a human is old but not yet failing. He had been, before the occupation, a teacher of children in the 3rd largest settlement. He was not on the lattice. He held no office, commanded no militia, organized no labor. He came into our custody almost by accident, in a sweep, because he had been standing in a square reading aloud from a printed sheet to a small crowd, and a sweep team brought in anyone addressing a crowd as a matter of routine. He was, on paper, nobody, an old schoolteacher with ink on his fingers. I interviewed him myself only because I happened to be in that detention center inspecting it, and the duty officer mentioned they had a talker, and I was curious what a talker on a pacified world found to talk about. I will describe him as I remember him because the board has only ever seen his file photograph, and the photograph does not carry it. He was not large. He had a settler's weathered hands and a stillness to him that I mistook at first for the resignation of the elderly. He sat across the interview table from me with his cuffed hands resting in his lap, and he looked at me the way you might look at weather, not afraid, not defiant, simply present and patient, as though he had a great deal of time and had decided to spend some of it on me. I asked him what he had been reading to the crowd. He told me it was a list of names, the names of the people we had removed in the first reduction. He had been reading them aloud, he said, so that the people in the square would know them. I asked him why that mattered. The people were gone. He considered the question as though it were a serious one, which I now realize it was, and he said, so that everyone knows the names, so that nobody has to wonder who's missing, so that each person can carry one. I did not understand him. I thought it was sentiment, the human attachment to their dead, which our xenologists had documented, and which we generally found useful, because grief is a paralytic. I wrote in my notes that the detainee exhibited typical post-reduction mourning behavior and was of no operational interest. I ordered him held, not out of suspicion, but because it is easier to hold an old man than to process his release, and I had a war. I thought of it then as a reduction, not a war to run. So that each person can carry one. He said that to me on day 51, and I filed it and forgot it, and it took me 11 cycles to understand that he had just told me, plainly and without malice, exactly how we were going to lose. The acceleration began well. By the end of the first cycle, we had run 4 more lattice reductions, each one cleaner than the last. Because the population gave us no resistance to speak of, we removed the replacement council heads. We removed the new militia coordinators who had stepped into Okonkwo's structure. We removed labor organizers, 2 of the 3 water engineers, a man who ran a printing operation, several of the louder religious voices. By doctrine, each strike should have weakened the structure further, should have made the next strike easier, should have bent the curve of resistance steadily down toward zero, where governance becomes possible. I had a curve. The office requires it. It is the central instrument of our work, a simple plotted line, reductions performed against incidents of organized resistance, and on every world I had ever administered, the line did what a reduced structure does. It fell. More reductions, less resistance. The two move against each other. That is the entire premise of the method. That is the law the office is built on. On Cestin 7, the curve did not fall. I noticed it first as a flatness. We were removing leaders at an increasing rate, and the level of organized resistance was not climbing. I want to be precise. It was not a rising insurgency, not at first, but it was not falling either. It sat flat, holding level, refusing to respond to the pressure we were putting on it. Sub-Provost Sund brought me the plot at the end of the first cycle, and we looked at it together for a long time without speaking, because neither of us had ever seen a flat line on that chart, and neither of us had a word for it. Sund was a better doctrine officer than I was a magistrate, and she said the thing that should have turned us around right then. She said, "We're removing leaders and the resistance isn't getting more leaderless." She said it slowly, the way you say a sentence you don't yet believe. "Magistrate, every council we cut, there's a council again within the period. We're not intercepting the orders that rebuild them. There aren't any orders. They're just back." I told her the obvious thing. I told her we were missing the real lattice. I told her the visible council and the visible militia were a decoy, that the humans had a hidden command structure underneath, the way sophisticated populations sometimes do, and that our mapping had captured the puppet and missed the hand. This is a known phenomenon. We have a doctrine for it. You stop striking the visible structure, you go quiet. You watch to see who the visible structure reports to, and you map the hidden lattice and take that head instead. So we went quiet. For 30 days we performed no reductions at all, and we watched, with everything we had: signal intercepts, informant networks, surveillance of every replaced leader, pattern analysis on movement and communication. We watched to catch the moment a new council head received instruction from above. We watched for the hand behind the puppets. I want the board to understand what we found in those 30 days, because it is the center of everything, and because it is the thing no board has been willing to write down plainly. We found that there was no hand, there was no hidden lattice, there was no secret command. The replaced leaders were not receiving orders from anyone because there was no one above them to give orders. They had simply, each of them, decided to do the work that the removed person had been doing. A woman whose neighbor had run the water committee and who had watched us take that neighbor started keeping the water committee's records herself. Not because anyone asked her, not because of any plan. She simply understood that the work needed doing, that the person who had done it was gone, and that this made it now her work. When we took her, the man across the lane understood the same thing about himself, on the same day, without a word passing between them. Sund ran the analysis 4 times because she could not believe the result. The replacement of a removed human leader was not a communications event. It produced no signal for us to intercept because it required no communication. It happened inside individual heads, privately, simultaneously, across a whole population, in response to nothing but the absence itself. We had spent 30 days listening for the order that rebuilds the structure, and the terrible thing we finally understood was that the order is the absence. Remove a leader, and the removal is the order. Every human who notices the gap reads it as instruction. That one is gone, so now it falls to me. So that each person can carry one. I went back to my notes from day 51, and I read the old man's sentence again. and I sat in my office for a long time with the chart in front of me and the sentence in my head, and I understood, finally, the shape of the thing I was inside. You cannot take the head of a body that grows a head wherever you cut. I want to be careful here because every board wants me to make this sound like magic, like some mystic property of the human soul, and it is not magic and the humans are not mystics. It is a behavioral fact, and it has, the office's xenologists later told me, a sober biological grounding, and the soberness is what makes it so much worse than magic. A magic enemy you might hope to find the trick of. This is not a trick. This is what the animal is. The xenologists explained it to me afterward, in the long cycle of inquiries, and I will give the board the explanation as it was given to me, because the board needs it more than I did. Humans are a species that evolved in small cooperative bands, and the bands that survived were the ones in which any member could, on the death of the band's coordinator, take up the coordinating function without being told to. A band that froze when its leader fell, that stood about waiting for instruction that would never come, that band died. So the surviving lineages are the ones in which leadership is not a position held by one individual, but a function latent in every individual, waiting. Every human carries the whole role inside them, dormant, the way they carry the capacity to run or to grieve. Most of the time it stays dormant because someone else is doing it. Remove that someone and in the humans nearest the gap the latent thing wakes. It does not require election. It does not require communication. It does not even, the xenologists stressed to me, require the human to want it. The teacher who has never led anything in his life finds himself, the morning after the council is taken, doing the council's work, often to his own surprise. The xenologist who briefed me used a phrase I have not been able to put down. He said, "Magistrate, you have been trying to behead a species that treats every beheading as a promotion. You sent each one of them their commission, 9 million commissions. You signed them yourself." I signed them myself. That is the truth of my administration of Sestin 7, and I will not soften it. Every reduction order I signed, believing I was weakening the structure, was an instruction to 9 million people that the roll was now open. The harder I struck, the more leaders I made. The curve did not fall because the curve could not fall. The premise of my entire profession, that a population is a structure with a finite number of columns, and that removing the columns brings it down, is simply not true of this species. There are no columns. There are 9 million columns. Every one of them is load-bearing, and every one of them is also a replacement column for every other, and the building does not come down because the building is not held up by its leaders. The building is its leaders, all of them, all at once. I gave the order to resume reductions anyway. I want the board to understand why, because I think it is the most damning thing in this entire testimony, more damning than any tactical error. I understood the trap by the end of the second cycle. I had the xenologist's explanation. I had Sun's analysis. I had the flat curve and the old man's sentence. I understood that every strike made the problem worse, and I resumed striking, because I did not have another doctrine. And a provost magistrate who admits he has no doctrine has admitted he has no purpose, and I was not yet ready to be a man without a purpose. So I told myself that the analysis must be incomplete, that surely there was some threshold, some point at which even this species would run out of replacements, that if I simply cut deep enough and fast enough, I would reach the bottom of the well. I told myself, the well had a bottom because I could not bear a well that did not. The well did not have a bottom. I will spare the board the cycle-by-cycle account of finding that out, except to say that the resistance curve, which had held flat through the second cycle, began in the third cycle to climb, and I understood by then exactly why. I had spent 2 cycles teaching 9 million people by direct demonstration. That leadership was a thing every one of them could and now must take up. I had run a planet-wide course of instruction in distributed command, with myself as the instructor, and the curriculum was every leader I removed. By the third cycle, they were no longer simply replacing leaders. They were, All of them leaders, and a planet of 9 million leaders does not produce a resistance you can map, because there is nothing to map. There is no lattice. There is no structure to take the head of. There is only a medium, an entire population in which the resistance is dissolved evenly through every single person, the way salt is dissolved through the sea, with no grain to remove that would make the sea less salt. This is when the dying started in earnest, and I want to be honest with the board about the dying, because the early boards encouraged me to dwell on it, as though the casualties were the story. They were not the story. They were the symptom, but the board should know them. Sub-Provost Lyra's son died in the 4th cycle, in the settlement we had designated the administrative capital, when the building she worked in was brought down. There was no warning, by which I mean there was no detectable plan we had failed to detect. We had our best signal analysts on that city. They intercepted nothing, because there was nothing to intercept. The action that killed Sund and 40 of my personnel was not planned by a cell we could have rolled up. It was, as best we could ever reconstruct it, arrived at independently by perhaps a dozen ordinary humans who each, separately, understood that the building needed to come down and understood roughly how, and converged on the doing of it without ever holding a meeting. There was no leader to capture afterward, because there was no leader. There were a dozen people, each of whom had become, in that act, the leader, and most of whom we never identified, because they went back to being a baker and a pipe fitter and a clerk the next morning, carrying the thing they had done quietly, the way Crane had told me each of them would carry a name. I went to see Crane after Sund died. I'm not proud of why. I went because he was the only human I had ever spoken to at length, and because I had begun, by the 4th cycle, to feel that the entire population was a single thing that I was failing to understand, and Crane was the only face that thing had ever shown me. I went to his cell and I sat down across from him with the same table between us, and I asked him, the way you ask whether it intends to break, when it would stop. He looked at me for a while. He had been in our custody for years by then. He had not been mistreated. I want that on the record. My detention centers were run correctly, but he was older and the years showed. He still had the stillness. I asked him who was leading them. I was past pretending by then that I did not need to know. I asked him directly, tell me who is leading the resistance and I will end the reductions. I meant it. I would have signed that deal. And he said, I have the exact words, because I wrote them down the moment I left the cell, and I have read them more times than I have read any doctrine, he said. You still think it's a who? I told him it was always a who. Everything is a who. Somebody decides, somebody organizes, somebody is at the top. Not with us, he said. He said it gently. That is the thing I cannot get past, even now in front of this board. He said it gently, the way you correct a child who has the arithmetic wrong, not the way you taunt an enemy. You keep cutting the top off because you think there's a top. There's no top. You took the council, so the street took over. You took the street, so the houses took over. You take the houses, it'll be the rooms. You take a man, the man next to him already knows what to do, and he didn't have to be told, because he watched you take the last one and he learned the lesson you keep teaching. We are not a thing with a head, magistrate. We never were. You've been trying to kill a body by removing its top, and we don't have a top. We have 9 million tops. You'll run out of orders before we run out of people willing to be the next name on the list. I asked him, and this is the question that I think finally finished me, because of the way he answered it. I asked him why they kept doing it. Why an old teacher, a baker, a pipe fitter, a clerk, none of them soldiers, none of them organizers, would each in turn step into a role that they had to know would end with them on a reduction order. Why each of them accepted the commission I never meant to send. He thought about it, then he said, because the one before us did, that's the whole of it. You took someone who stepped up and the rest of us watched, and now we can't not step up because they did. You didn't break the chain when you took them. You forged the next link. Every name you read off the list, somebody in the square hears it and decides to be the next one. You're not reducing us, you're recruiting for us. You've been the best recruiter we ever had, and you did it for free, and you signed every enlistment." I had no answer for him. I have no answer for the board either. There is no counter to it. That is what I came, over 19 cycles, to understand. There is no counter to it within our doctrine, because our doctrine assumes a thing that is not true of this species. We assume the head exists. With humans, the head does not exist, or rather it exists 9 million times over, dormant in each of them. And the only way to take all the heads is to take all the people. And that is not reduction, that is extermination of 9 million. And the ascendancy did not occupy Cestin 7 to spend 9 million lives and 40,000 of our own on a settlement world of 11 towns. The arithmetic of the occupation never closed. It could not close. By the 7th cycle, I had personally signed reduction orders against more than 4,000 human leaders, and there were more leaders at the end of the 7th cycle than there had been at the start, because I had spent 7 cycles teaching every survivor that leadership was now their inheritance and their duty. I want to address the question this board has not yet asked, but the previous boards always did, which is whether there was a point at which I could have changed the outcome by changing the method. The answer is no, and I will defend the no. We tried the inversions. When decapitation only made the problem worse, we tried the opposite. We tried elevation. We tried to find humans we could install as collaborating leaders, to give the population a head of our choosing, so that the latent leadership in the rest of them would stay dormant, deferring to the head we had provided. This is sound doctrine on other worlds. On Cestin 7, it failed for the same reason everything failed. The humans did not defer to a head we provided because they did not, fundamentally, operate by deferring to a single head at all. The collaborators we installed were not obeyed. They were, instead, quietly worked around by a population that simply continued to coordinate itself laterally, person to person, the way it always had, treating our installed leader as an irrelevance to be endured. And the few humans who did accept our commissions, I will not call them traitors, the situation was beyond such words, found themselves leading nothing, because there was no follower-shaped mass beneath them to lead. There were only other latent leaders, each carrying the whole role, none of them in the habit of waiting to be told. We tried saturation. We flooded the population with our own administration, put a Marethi authority in every settlement, every block, took over every function the human committees had performed, so that there would be no work left for the latent leadership to wake up and do. This is the costliest doctrine, and we tried it last, in the 12th and 13th cycles, and it failed in the most instructive way of all. You cannot leave a human population no work to coordinate, because if you remove the ordinary work, the water, the records, the disputes, the population simply coordinates around you, and the work it coordinates becomes us. We had wanted to deny them a structure to lead. We succeeded only in making ourselves the single remaining thing on the planet worth organizing against, and a population that organizes laterally, leaderlessly, with the resistance dissolved evenly through every person, is the worst possible thing to make yourself the sole object of. By the 13th cycle, the entire human population of Cestin 7, all 9 million of them, were, in the only sense that mattered, a single coordinated resistance, with no leader to capture, no cell to roll up, no head to take, and the ascendancy's entire science of governance had no instrument that could so much as describe the situation, let alone resolve it. I recommended withdrawal in the 15th cycle. It took 4 more cycles for Central to accept the recommendation, because Central, like me at the start, could not believe that 9 million settlers on 11 towns could not be reduced, and Central made me prove it the way Central makes everyone prove everything, slowly and expensively and in blood. But the proof was unanswerable, and in the 19th cycle, the Office of Civil Reduction did something it has done on only a handful of worlds in its history. It declared a population irreducible and ordered the administration withdrawn. We left Cestin 7. We had spent 19 cycles, 40,000 Marethi lives, and the entire weight of a doctrine that had pacified 240 worlds, and we left exactly the way we had come, except that the humans were now 9 million people who had each learned, by our direct and patient instruction, that they were each a leader, that leadership could not be taken from them because it lived in each of them, and that the more an empire cut at them, the more of them rose. We had not reduced them, we had concentrated them. We had taken a settlement world of ordinary committees and ordinary teachers and turned every last one of them with our own hands into the thing we feared. And then we had run out of orders, exactly as the old man said we would, and we had gone home. The board will want to know what became of Aldous Crane. We released him in the withdrawal. There was no reason to take him with us and no longer any function in holding him. I went to his cell myself on the last day to authorize the release, and I will tell the board the last exchange, and then I will be finished, because nothing I have to say afterward matters next to it. I told him we were leaving. I told him the occupation was over. I am not sure what I expected. Triumph, perhaps. He had earned it. He had told me the truth on day 51, and I had spent 19 cycles refusing to hear it. And now I was standing in his cell admitting that he had been right and I had been beaten, and any creature would be entitled to triumph. He did not triumph. He stood up slowly, an old man at the end of a long captivity, and he picked up the printed sheet that the duty officer returned to him with his belongings, the same kind of sheet I had taken him for reading all those years ago in the square. He folded it and put it in his pocket. And then he looked at me, with that same stillness, that same patience, and he said the thing I have carried ever since, the thing I have repeated to 3 boards now, the thing the ascendancy still does not want to write down. He said, "You came here looking for the one who leads us. I'll tell you the truth now since you're going. You met him on the first day. He was the man you removed first, the one whose name I read in the square, and then it was the woman who took his chair, and then it was me for a while in my own small way, though you never knew it. And tomorrow it'll be a child in one of my old classes who isn't even grown yet. You kept asking which of us was the leader." He almost smiled. It was not cruel. It was the saddest thing I have ever seen on a face and the most certain. All of us, magistrate, that was always the answer. You just couldn't govern a people where the answer is all of us, so you spent 19 years killing us one at a time trying to find the one. There was never a one. Go home and tell them that. Tell them there was never a one. I went home. I have told them. I am telling them now, this board, for the 3rd time, the same thing the old man told me in the cell, because it is the only finding my testimony contains, and it will not change no matter how many uniforms ask me to repeat it. There was never a one. There is no head on this species to take. Every order we sent them, they read as a commission, and they accepted every commission because the one before them had, and they could not be the link that broke the chain. We did not lose Seston 7 because we were sloppy. We lost it because we were thorough, and thoroughness against this enemy is a method of recruitment. The Office of Civil Reduction was built on a law that a population is a structure with a head, and that taking the head brings it down. That law is true of every people the ascendancy has ever faced. It is not true of humans, and until this board and the boards above this board are willing to write that single sentence into doctrine, we will go to the next human world believing we can take its head, and we will spend 19 cycles and 40,000 lives discovering, again, the thing one old schoolteacher tried to hand me, free of charge, on the 51st day. He told me to carry one name. I have carried his. I would recommend the board carry it too. There was never a one. Write it down.